Hello, and welcome to Taste and See. This is a Peace Church Sunday School class, and I am your host, Todd Blanchon. Let's see what the Lord can do with us during this time.
Hi, and welcome to Taste and See. I'm Todd. Glad you're with us today. We are plumbing the depths of Psalm 34. We're using it as the launch point for discussions about major topics in Christianity. And today we're going to discuss the fear of the Lord. I recall some time back when inviting a man to church, to attend church with me, that he said, "Oh, I don't go to church. There are too many hypocrites there." Thought about this for a second, and I said, "Well, we can always make room for one more, so please come." That's a joke that people like to tell, but church is for hypocrites. It's for addicts. It's for sinners. It's for prostitutes. It's for whores. It's for people who are thieves, who lie, who cheat. It is for all of us. You know, when I think about hypocrites, I think about me. The most often used charge against the Pharisees, which were the conservative religious folks of Jesus' day, by Jesus himself, was hypocrite, you actor. You say one thing but you do another. As I was preparing for this lesson, I was praying and realized that I am a hypocrite. And I'm a hypocrite because my purity of mind isn't what it should be. And my dependence on the Lord doesn't ever seem to be 100%. There's always some measure of compromise in my mind. I don't know if you've ever had that thought about yourself as well. But all of these things, all of these perplexing sins that I just mentioned, they have one thing in common as to a potential cure. And David talks about that in Psalm 34. And this is how it reads. I'm going to start with verse 7 of Psalm 34, Psalm of David. "The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them." And then I'm going to skip ahead to verse 11. "Come, O children, listen to me, and I will teach you the fear of the Lord." What is this thing called fear of the Lord? Last week we talked about God delivering. In verse 4 it says, "I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears." But this fear seems to be something we should cultivate as opposed to be delivered from. So what is this thing called the fear of the Lord? Because apparently it's key to being delivered. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. "O come, O children, listen to me, and I will teach you the fear of the Lord." It seems to be central to this understanding. And then in verse 9, David says again, "O fear the Lord, you his saints, for those who fear him have no lack." So apparently, fear of the Lord is central to being delivered. It's central to not having any wants. And it's something we should teach each other as Christians. This is specifically speaking to Christians. So let's figure this out. Is it respect, as some have said? I heard a preacher once tell that means respect. It doesn't actually mean fear. However, if you actually look at the Bible, what it says about the fear of the Lord, the context it's used more often is when Israel as a nation is being thought about by other nations, and it says the fear of the Lord came upon them. I think it was real fear. I think it was terror. I think they were gripped by an emotional negative response to the idea of doing battle with Israel, or being killed or even eliminated as a people. So I don't think you can pass that off as respect. I think you have to actually say that is fear. And in the context that I've read it, it seems to be you are supposed to fear. We're going to talk about what Isaiah says about it, because Isaiah is a prophet who lived around 800 BC, and he was definitely understood the fear of the Lord. But before we do that, I want to try to give you an understanding of some common analogies. And I found a helpful website. Dr. Peter Wins has a nice thing on instruction in righteousness. And he talks about reaping and sowing. And now this is not about salvation, folks. This is not about your grace-given right to heaven that God has guaranteed. And when I say right, I mean right. Once He's given you salvation, it is yours. It is an eternal gift. And you now have, because God has said you have in something that cannot be taken from you. But what is this fear of the Lord then? And how can it be the beginning of wisdom then? How does this, if God is so good and so kind and so nice, well, God is also righteous. He's just and He's pure. And the problem is that we are not. So how do we become more like Him? Well, again, Dr. Peter Wins says that if you want to catch a flight early in the morning, you better set an alarm, or you probably won't sleep very well, and even then you probably won't sleep very well, because if you wake up late, the plane's going to take off and you will miss it. And what he's talking about is reaping and sowing. The things that we do, the things that we say, the things that we are to other people bring a return. And we have the opportunity as Christians to be a blessing or to not be a blessing. And when we're not being a blessing, we're missing something. We're missing out on what God has for us. For instance, I'm afraid of not going to church regularly. I do not trust myself. I do not trust my heart. I know I wander in my heart frequently, and 6 days is about all it takes for me to need another dose of realizing that God is in charge. I'm also a person who tithes, and the reason I tithe is I'm afraid of missing out on God's blessings. In Malachi 3:8, God very explicitly says, if you do not tithe, you're stealing from me. I have taken that to heart. I do not want to be a thief of the Lord's stuff. And what's fascinating about that section of Malachi is that it also says that you need to trust me, says the Lord. Bring the tithe in and see if I don't pour out blessings overflowing for you. there have been a couple moments in my life where I have actually had to look at God in a prayerful moment and say, Lord, I have tithed, and this does not feel like a blessing. Where is the abundance of overflowing that you have called me to? You know, I believe you. I trust you. I want this to work out. And you know what, folks, every time he's come through, I once remember saying, Lord, if this doesn't change, I'll be sleeping under a bridge, and so will my wife. And then I just laughed and said to him, because he owns everything. He owns all the bridges. He owns everything. The cattle on 1,000 hills, as Scripture says. But I said, but you know, if that's what you want me to have, is the underbridge ministry, then that's what I'll do. And of course, I don't sleep under a bridge. Now, some people may be called to sleep under bridges, and I'm not saying that God guarantees us all a certain amount of wealth and prosperity, but what I am saying is that fear of what God has said, fear of who He is, and how He perceives reality in our time, can either yield us a blessing or it can yield us a curse. So let's delve into Isaiah and let's see about what it is that fear of the Lord means. So Isaiah the prophet, who the heck is he? Well, Isaiah is probably one of the most messianic prophets in the entire Old Testament. You literally can piece together the gospel in his many, many writings. He talks a great deal about the coming Messiah, the King, and he talks about all sorts of things, including his name is Emmanuel, God with us. And we get many of the phrases that we know in the Christmas period from Isaiah. For unto us a child is born. And there are great descriptions about the lion and the lamb lying down together. Here in Isaiah 11 is a description that talks about who the coming Messiah would be like. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from the roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. There's our fear of the Lord again. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. And he shall not judge by what his eye sees, or decide disputes by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. So this is a description of Jesus who is coming. And there are many, many descriptions in here. To go through it would take a number of Sunday school classes, but let us just say that Isaiah got a clear idea of who the Messiah was. How did he get that idea? How do you suppose Isaiah got it? Well, let's understand a little bit about Isaiah. He was probably born around 800 BC, maybe as late as 760 BC. In his text, Isaiah writes that he preached during the time of King Uzziah. King Uzziah was the 10th king of the southern kingdom of Judah. And King Uzziah, from a political standpoint, was actually quite a good king. He was the king who raised the military to finally defeat, for once and for all, the Philistines. He also put the Ammonites under tribute and expanded the kingdom. He was probably the most prosperous king of the Judean era since Solomon. And however, his heart was not quite right with God, and in fact, when he disobeyed God, he was struck with leprosy, and he died in 740 BC. Now, at that time, there was the Assyrian superpower that basically surrounded or was about to surround Israel and Judah, and Isaiah was one of the prophets who was tasked by God to tell Judah and Israel that judgment was coming, that they were about to be sacked, and that it was not going to be good. It was right around this time that Isaiah had an experience with the Lord, which I think really will help us understand a little bit better what the fear of the Lord is like. Keep in mind, Isaiah was probably the most holy man of his day. He was certainly given a mouthpiece by which to call the people of Israel to repentance, which of course they did not do. Anyway, in Isaiah 6, we read a very famous passage about Isaiah encountering Jesus, actually, on the throne in the temple. So keep in mind, this is Solomon's temple, and God actually dwelled physically in the temple during this time. And this is what it says in chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With two he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called. The house was filled with smoke, and I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Isaiah then goes on to talk about the Lord speaking to him. He could then stand in his presence because his sin was atoned for. And Isaiah, seeing God very clearly, when God said, Who will go and speak for me? He said, I will go. And then God said, oh, by the way, they're not going to listen to you. I'm actually going to harden their hearts. And although they will hear you, they will not understand you. That's a very tough ministry, folks. But let's look at this a little more clearly. If you actually look at the part of Isaiah 6 that I read, all the elements of the temple are there. What he's seeing is the inside of the holies of holies, where the golden ark sat, and it was called the mercy seat of God, and God supposedly dwelled above the mercy seat. The seraphim that he saw were also in the temple. They were etched in stone and gilded with gold, and they were large, and they were displayed above the ark and on the walls. The smoke that is filling that was incense that was put in the room, and it signifies the prayers of the saints. And so Isaiah is actually seeing in real life what the temple was called to depict, what Solomon's temple was called to depict, which was actually the scene of the heavenly throne room that Jesus occupies as king. And Isaiah witnessed him. And when he saw him with his own eyes, the most holy man of his time, the one who, even before this time, had actually been given words directly from God himself to speak to the people, he says, "Woe to me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live amongst a people of unclean lips." You see, God's holiness is so great that when we come in contact with him in a state of non-grace, we cannot stand. We become convicted immediately of how perverted and how sinful and how wrong, and just every casual word that has come from our lips is something we should be judged for. And Isaiah is no exception to this. Even though he knows God, he has great faith, he's God's spokesperson already, when he sees Jesus, he becomes undone. He can't stand up, he can't do anything. In fact, it's preferable to have an ember from the altar. Now, this is also part of the imagery of the temple. It's preferable to have a burning ember from the altar of forgiveness touch your lips. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not really into putting burning embers on my body, anywhere, and especially not on my lips. There are a few places in the body that have a higher density of nerves than the lips, but only a couple. One of them's the eyeball. And so Isaiah has this angel, this seraphim, fly to him in an act of mercy, sticking a burning hot coal against his lips. And that's preferable to standing before the Lord in your sin. That's frankly hard to imagine, but hopefully you can get a feel for that. In God's mercy, that altar was the altar of sacrifice, and it ultimately represents what Jesus would come and do for us, allowing us to stand in God's presence, to look at him with our eyes, and to delight in him, and to worship him, and to be essentially his friend. Before, since Isaiah preceded Christ into the world, Isaiah had to have something from the temple in order to make that sacrifice, in order to make him holy enough to stand for that moment. But this is Jesus. We see that Jesus himself acknowledged that in the book of John, that Isaiah had seen him in the temple, that basically the two had met. And so we know this is Jesus. Isaiah talks about Jesus being filled with the fear of the Lord. So the fear of the Lord must be this sense of overriding power over everything that exists. Because Jesus was perfect. We know that from the life that he lived. And in his perfection, he was filled with the fear of the Lord. Do we have a fear of the Lord? Have we lost a sense of God's holiness? Do you steal from the Lord by not paying your tithes? Do you no longer have interest in going to church because of all the hypocrites that are there, myself included? Have you gotten into a licentious life where you are doing what you know is wrong? Some time ago, I was talking with a man who was living a lifestyle that he knew he should not be living. And I brought it to his attention that several of the things that he had mentioned in our conversation that day, as a church member, he should not be doing. And he just looked at me and he says, well, it's what everybody does. And I said, well, maybe so, but it's not what Christians are called to do. We are called to be a blessing and to live out as pure life as we can as a testimony to the purity of God who saved us. You can probably guess his response. He immediately repented, changed his ways, and went on. I'm jesting with you, of course. He immediately wrote me off as a friend, and I still have that pain to this day that I don't know him anymore. But he had an idea of a life he wanted to live, even though he claimed to be a Christian and probably is. Had seen God's working in his life, seen the blessings that came from compliance to God's ways many times in his life. Later in life, he chose to ignore those. How many of us are doing that now in small ways? I mean, how many of us cheat on our taxes? How many of us speak against those brothers and sisters that we have in the Lord, even small things? How many of us really are watching what our tongue says and what our hearts and minds do? I know I struggle with this. I'm guessing you do too. The good news is that if you're a sinner like me, and you're a sinner like Uzziah, and you're a sinner like David, King David, Jesus has come to save us. Your salvation is assured. Once saved, always saved, folks. But if you're not receiving God's blessings today, maybe you need to look at your lifestyle. Maybe you need to look at the way you're thinking. Maybe you need to look at the things you're doing. Maybe you need to start tithing. And maybe you need to hold God to his promise. It's the only place, by the way, Malachi 3:8, it's the only place where God tells you to test him on it. He says, bring in your tithe. Bring in 1/10 of what you make a year. And test me. It's the only place God says it. Try it. You might be surprised. I've actually heard some interesting things from friends of mine as they have begun tithing. There was a time I didn't tithe. I was a Christian. I was saved. I knew I was saved. I didn't tithe for many years. But when I began to have a fear of the Lord, I began to realize that I don't want to be stealing from God. And so I began to tithe, and I trust in His promises. His promises, He has blessed me beyond reason. The blessings that He has poured over on my life go well beyond anything I deserve. And I just want to encourage you folks to trust Him, to put Him to His word. He's good for it. He can handle it. He is God after all. Stick around, I've got a good recipe I'd love to share with you. Today, folks, we're going to learn how to make a Lyman Meringue Pie. This is a beautiful pie. It can be made in less than an hour, and it tastes pretty amazing. One of my favorite desserts. Well, today we're going to make Lyman Meringue Pie. That's right, I said Lyman, not lemon. And what Lyman Meringue Pie is, it's a combination of lemon meringue pie with lemon bars with key lime pie. And that combination makes a great combination. In fact, I love key lime pie and I love lemon bars. And I'm sort of okay with lemon meringue pie, but my wife came up with this idea of combining them, and I thought it was great. So what we're going to need for this today is we're going to need a pie crust, and you can use any type you want. Typical is a graham cracker. This happens to be a pecan, but you can also get gluten-free. You can get almond, you can get walnut. Lots of different options out there for you. You'll need some lemons. We're going to do some fresh squeezed lemons. You will need some key lime juice. Now I want to encourage you to get either real key limes and juice them, or to get something like this, which is good key lime juice. And in fact, this particular brand has the recipe that we're going to modify on the back. You will need a can of sweetened condensed milk. This is going to be sweet. 3 eggs. You'll need a 1/4 cup of sugar. You'll need a 1/4 teaspoon of cream of tartar, and this is for our meringue. And you'll need some mixers. In fact, you'll need 2 mixers unless you're really good at cleaning. You'll need a bowl and a mixer for actually combining your pie ingredients. You'll need a scrupulously cleaned bowl and mixer, and it doesn't have to be 40 years old to make your meringue. So let's get started. First step is we're going to prepare the pie crust. And the pie crust in of itself is very good. It has a lot of sugar in it. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a lemon, cut it in half, use our lemon juicer here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to squeeze some lemon juice liberally on the pie crust. We want to get it nice and wet. And we want to get it all up and down the sides of that. That is going to soak into that pie crust and make it very lemony. We're now going to take the pie crust and we're going to put it in the oven at between 250 and 300 for about 10 to 15 minutes, or until it is dry and toasty. The second step is to make our pie ingredients. We're going to need both bowls for this. We're going to separate our eggs because we want our whites in our clean bowl that will go into our mixer, and we want the yolks in our metal bowl that will be used for our pie filling. We're then going to set our whites aside and mix them in the meringue later. We're now going to take our sweetened condensed milk and mix that in. And this is good stuff, so we want to scrape it out. Get all of it. We're now going to mix in our key lime juice and our lemon juice. Now the recipe on the bottle says you need a half a cup of the key lime juice to make a key lime pie, but we're making a Lyman meringue pie. So we're going to use half of that with key lime, and we're going to take half of that as lemon juice. The lemon juice is approximately 2 large lemons squeezed. I'm going to mix that in. Now we're going to pull our pie crust out. And it really smells fantastic. And that's actually very good even right now. That would be just tasty just to eat that. Simply then pour our pie filling into our pie crust once our pie crust is cooled down enough. And now we're going to make our meringue. Meringue is very easy to make. We're just taking the egg whites that we separated earlier. Go ahead. Once you get to what's called stiff peaks with your meringue is ready to be spread and then placed on your pie and baked. But I'm going to add right now just a little bit of lemon zest into the meringue just to actually make it a little more lemony. Pile it onto our pie crust with the filling in it. And voila, it's ready for baking. We're now going to put this into the oven at 350 degrees.
The instructions on the bottle of key lime juice say to cook for 15 minutes, but since we're adding meringue, you're going to need to add at least 10 minutes to that. So you'll cook it for 25 minutes or until the top of your meringue is a golden brown. It should be quite beautiful. This is a wonderful, fresh, and encouraging dessert that you can share with your small group or your family. And I just want to encourage you to give it a try. If you love key lime, if you love lemon bars, and if you love lemon meringue, this is the pie.